has more
Okay, great. So now, I mean,
single family and so much and remodeling.
Well, good morning, everybody. I don't like the seating already at the back, but we're going to have to live with that, I'm sure. Welcome to the session. There are three panelists you'll see in the program. Kate Hammer is not here. She's on her way, and when she gets here, we'll enjoy her contribution. This is going to be a really informal and a hopefully entertaining and informative session. My name is Jeff Sprang. I'm Director of Communications for Ontario Public School Boards Association, and I'm really delighted to be here this morning. We have the most amazing panelists that you can imagine. We're going to be discussing the media as it relates to public education. And there's some commonality between the two, I think. These days, public education and media, there's an intense scrutiny on how things are done. Parents have the right, and they need to know what's going on in the classroom, how their kids are doing, and by and large, they're informed by stories in the media. And so the media plays a critical role in our democratic society of informing parents, and how they tell their story influences government, it influences funding, it influences curriculum, and it influences our kids' education. So they play a very important role, and today we're going to find out from three, well, at least two right now, and hopefully a third expert on what they do, how they do it. My hope is at the end of this you'll have a better understanding of how the media works, and also how you can work with the media to tell your stories. Because looking around the room, there's a few people here that have had a little bit of experience with the media, and some have had too much experience with the media. Can, no names. So I think how the format will be, I'll introduce the panelists and allow them to say some words. I'll ask some questions, and I think we'll open it up. And if you have questions, comments, then you'll be more than welcome to participate. I want this to be participatory. Pia said that she's not going to do a 30-minute speech, so I'm kind of pleased to hear that, actually. So, Pia Chattopadhyay, broadcast host and reporter currently based in Toronto. She's reported on a wide range of issues from politics in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and the Asian tsunami to health, education, social issues, and culture. A seasoned journalist with 15 years of experience, she has worked for various news outlets in Canada and abroad. Pia was the Middle East correspondent for Fox News Radio, and currently a guest host on various CBC radio programs, including The Current, Metro Morning, and The World at 6. In addition to her work at CBC, Pia is host of PBO's Big Ideas and summer fill-in host for The Agenda with Steve Pankin. Welcome, Pia. Moira McDonald has covered education issues for the Toronto Sun since 1997. It's a long time. She currently writes a twice-weekly freelance column on education politics, school trends and personalities, as well as curriculum topics, mostly K-12 sector. Through her own development and career, she has seen education from many different perspectives. As a graduate from a Scarborough Alternative High School, as a parent of a school-aged child, and as a teaching assistant at Ryerson University School of Journalism. She holds an MA in journalism from the University of Western Ontario. Welcome, Moira. I'm sure Kate's going to join us. So Kate Hammer is the education reporter at the Globe and Mail. She's an award-winning journalist and the product of multiple top-notch public, private, French, English, and Catholic schools. She never got kicked out of any of these schools. Her parents just moved around a lot. They had no idea they were preparing her for a current job. And if that makes sense to you, Kate was the crime reporter for the New York Times, so a little bit about her past is informed her career present. Ms. Moore, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind, and welcome.
Great, thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. I feel like half the room I've covered at some point. It'll be an interesting conversation. It's a shame that Kate isn't here yet, but I look forward to hearing from her because Kate will be able to talk more about covering education as a reporter, as a news reporter. I come at it as a columnist, and as actually a freelance columnist for the Toronto Sun. So that sometimes leads to a little bit of confusion around what I'm doing and how I do it. Columnists, reporters, generally what they're doing is trying to report just the facts, ma'am. The 5 W's, who, what, where, when, how, why of a story. They're trying to just, cover all the bases with some balance, and they do not editorialize how they report the story. I, on the other hand, am coming at education stories as someone who is going to have an opinion about it. I also see my role as being a bit of an analyst of what's really going on here. You hear the news story of the basics of what's going on with an education story, and my role as I see it is to kind of try to go in deeper to another layer as to what's really happening behind that story, and to bring in maybe some of my background, having covered education for a long time, and giving some insight as to what are some of the underpinnings that go into those stories. So sometimes a lot of times people will disagree with your opinion, and may confuse that and say, you're not being fair or you're not being accurate, and sometimes it has to do with the argument that you're making. Sometimes it has to do with whether or not you have been accurate on your facts. So my obligation, as I see it, is to be truthful about my opinion, to check out the facts that I'm using to support my opinion, and to speak to a range of people as well. Columns, although we do see columns that are rants, and sometimes people think I'd love to have columns so I can just rail on about what I think about X. My job really has to be more than that, and it does involve understanding a wide range of opinion that goes into a particular issue, and then coming up with my take on it, and supporting that. So I don't know how long you want me to go on, because they gave me a bunch of questions to think about, and I can talk a little bit about.
I think from the previous session,
Yeah.
I should say, tell us more.
Tell us. Okay, so we were asked to think about what makes an education story newsworthy, and how do I get my story ideas. So I would say, when I think about how do I get my story ideas, it's really this, it's a soup of information that I'm pulling from. And so that includes just, what is happening during the week? What have been the latest education stories going on? And do I have something to say about that? It could be from school board agendas, going through the agenda, seeing what's coming up, seeing if there's some interesting reports in there that I think I could do something on. Sometimes it's people emailing me with a news tip, or complaining. Sometimes it comes from a complaint. Somebody said, well, why didn't you talk about this? And then I may think, well, yeah, why? Maybe I should be asking some more questions about that. And I would say another really rich source of story ideas for me is just asking some really good questions about what is happening in schools, in education policy. So, as I said, you've got sort of the top layer of what may be happening news-wise, And so I'm reading those stories. I try to read a wide variety of media, listening to broadcast, and then trying to think, well, so what about, you know, I'm just trying to come up with some more questions, again, to go a little bit deeper into the issue. Twitter is another source of stories. It doesn't mean that I report verbatim on what somebody tweeted. I think people are getting a little savvier about what they put out on Twitter. So where once I might have got a really great story idea, I think a good example was Chris Spence, the director of the Toronto District School Board, tweeting about, should we pay kids to go to school? Well, I think I'll pick up the phone now, I
So
think
did we.
Other people might have picked up the phone too, but anyway, and I think the Star also caught that, so we were on that. I don't get quite as many good tweet tips like that now, but I follow that too. And then you might wonder about news releases. I mean, I do get plenty of news releases, and that's good for just helping me to keep tabs on what's going on. But again, I'm looking for the next layer, the next level, and I'm trying to analyze, you know, what can I pull out of this that's going to be interesting for my readers in a column. I cover education politics. I cover, although I try not to get, I was warned by a great editor of mine, Lori Goldstein, you know, we don't cover insider baseball. So, you know, sometimes, you know, when you're right in all of this stuff, it's hard to know what do sort of the general public care about and what do you find really interesting when you've been right inside the system. So, minding the money. It's a big system. Spending is second behind healthcare, so I do feel that I have an obligation, along with other reporters, to be keeping tabs on how money is spent in education. What's new and coming up at school boards that people might not know about, but need to know about. Trends, and just what's happening in education policy, you know, bullying, for example, equity and inclusion issues, that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I tend to focus what I write about. I get an awful lot of news releases pushing corporate stuff, like companies working with the school board, oh, we've got all these computers, or I get a ton of that stuff, and for the most part, that stuff gets deleted very quickly. I think there was a news release a few years ago where there was a private school in Toronto that was switching completely over to digital books, and I wasn't quite sure if I was going to do that. I think Louise Brown at the Star went and did it. It was a great story. So once in a while, those news releases yield a good story, but most of the time not. I like to do what other people aren't. I feel that's another role for me as a columnist. Is you know, the reporters are responsible for kind of informing the public about the general scope of what's going on in education. I feel my role is maybe to pull something out that people might not be aware of. Since I'm working as a columnist and as a freelance columnist, that does give me some freedom to do that. When it comes to choosing story ideas, I was asked actually by the conference organizers, you know, how many people do you have to run your idea by before it gets approved? It's like, I don't run my ideas by anybody. A lot of days, my editor has no idea what I'm writing about until I filed the column. Once in a very long while, the Sun being the Sun, has some strong interests and angles, and I might be approached and asked, you know, would you write a column on, you know, taking this particular position, and if I don't feel that that's a position I would personally hold, then I'll say, I don't think I'm your person for this. And that has been perfectly fine. So I do feel grateful that I have that amount of freedom. Although it is nice to also be able to run your ideas by people to see, you know, whether you're completely half-cocked and nobody would care anyway. So that is a helpful thing. Okay, making decisions about what I cover. Here's some of the things that come into play. One is time. Is the idea that I have timely? Does it tie into what's happening in the sector? And if it doesn't, that might still be okay, because that falls into the realm of people don't know this is happening, but they need to know. Do I think people will be interested or should be interested? And those two things do not necessarily intersect. I might think that something's really important for people to know, and I'll do all kinds of research on it, and that will get almost very few hits or responses online, which is not necessarily an indicator of how much interest is out there in a given story. But I find that with my colleagues too. Sometimes the stories that you hardly put any effort into are wildly popular, and the stuff that you had to work really hard on because there isn't a lot written on it kind of sails right over people's heads. So, and then another factor is, am I interested? If I don't, and that again is the privilege and the freedom I have as a columnist. Is, you know, I can choose not to cover something if if I'm really just tired of hearing the same thing on a particular topic, then I'll just go and chase something else. How much time will the story need? For reporters and columnists, that time is always of the essence. For me, I'm trying to plan ahead. I write 2 columns a week. They appear Wednesdays and Sundays in the paper. And so I do try to plan ahead, start to make calls at least a few days in advance of when I actually have to file the column. But sometimes you just I get to Tuesday morning and I'm like, gee, what am I gonna write about? Okay, what could I do in the next 4 hours? So maybe some of Roger Martin's thinking is going on there. So sometimes I might get an email from somebody that just happened to hit on at the right time. It's Monday afternoon, and I'm not sure what I'm going to write for my Wednesday column, and I go, wow, I think I could do that tomorrow. And some stories require more calls. Sometimes it's hard to get people to get back to you that fast. So I'm kind of sizing things up as to, how quickly do I think I can put this together and do it well. As far as what doesn't get covered, I mentioned, the corporate press releases. I don't see myself as somebody who sells stuff for other people. I'm not there to do an ad. And I'm also, I don't see myself as a cheerleader for public education. And I know that sounds odd and maybe bad, but it doesn't mean I'm against public education. It means, in my mind, I'm here to be a thoughtful critic, an analyst, again, to bring my knowledge of the system to ask some good questions and try to answer them. There's plenty of people out there who are cheerleaders for public education, and I can go and I can quote them, and they can speak for themselves. And obviously, people don't read my stuff unless they're interested in public education. So, that said, I have to say that pretty much all of my stories focus on the public education system as opposed to private schools, or what's going on in private schools. Again, most of my readers, that's going to be what they're interested in. I don't tend to cover events, so I get a lot of stuff from school boards about, sports games, cool personality coming into the school, we raise this much money for X. I find unless, again, I can get into another layer with that story, it really isn't fodder for me. There might be an interesting human interest story in, how we raise money for something. maybe a particular school reached out to another school on a different continent, and there was a really interesting human relationship story that went on there. But unless people kind of give me a hint that that's part of that story, I'm probably not going to have the time to dig very deep to find that out. So, I was asked, what's your obligation to sell papers versus my obligation to inform the public? As far as I see it, I have no obligation whatsoever to sell papers. My publisher has an obligation to sell papers. If I do my job well, I think that should carry things a long way. So I don't, and that's probably why I'm a writer and not a salesperson, because I don't know how to do the sell job, but I do know how to investigate interesting stories and tell them in a compelling way. I think probably got a few more other things to say, but I'm sure those will come up in the questions. I was also asked, what is the media really covering all the important news stories? Well, I would not be so egotistical as to think that we are covering all the important education stories. We try to cover all the important education stories, but it really is. It's still. I've got an obligation to think and research and ask good questions, but it's a two-way street too. And if people really feel that we're missing things, then email us and tell us what we're missing and tell us what the good questions are that we should be asking. And don't be afraid to be, just because you send in an email that you're going to get quoted. If that's just an occasion for me to email you back and say, tell me more, that sort of thing. So, anyway, hi. Welcome, Kate.
It's terribly embarrassing. I'm sorry.
No one knows why you're late, Kate. You know what I'm
Oh,
saying?
well, I'll tell you, there's lots of stuff going on at York University. And I'm glad I checked it out. Well, your sympathy's really helping, thank you.
Anyway, I'm done my own spiel. I was telling you about how I do what I do and
Much
Where
better
you
than you
started?
came.
where I get my
by the
Oh,
way.
yeah, that's just great.
what
Very humbling, yeah.
what I cover, why, and what I don't cover.
Great.
So anyway, but
No, that was very well done. So,
You want me to talk next? You want me
Yeah,
to?
that'd be great, yeah.
I feel a little like I'm cutting you guys off, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to do that, but there are other chairs here if you want to sneak in. I don't have a big back, but I feel like I'm trying to. I won't talk as long as Moira because I'm in the business of broadcast and we tell stories about wars and conflict and families in about a minute and a half. So that's a little bit I'm used to. That said, I'll probably drone on a little bit. So just to tell you a little bit more about what I do and my experience with covering education. I'm a bit of a moonlighting journalist. I work at two public broadcasters, the CBC, which I've worked at for many years, for about 15, since 97 was the first time I worked at CBC, and TVO. For those of you, I'm sure you're all familiar with TVO. TVO falls under the Ministry of Education of Ontario, so its mandate is very clear in that regard. It is to educate the citizens of Ontario. So I'm not going to speak too much about TVO, only because I think you're all familiar with it and know that it's a smaller organization than the CBC to navigate as people like yourselves. So I'm going to speak more about the CBC experience, but happy to answer questions as it pertains to TVO as we move along. I first covered education in Ontario, in Toronto specifically, back in 2003. I was a general assignment reporter with the local Toronto newsroom, and it was a time when school boards were in financial trouble, I would say, and in conflict. In conflict with the government, and I can see some faces that I recognize from back then. That was 2003. I know that People for Education at that time was not as it was at its beginnings, just a small group of mothers, but it is astonishing for me to see how much this organization has grown in the last number of years. So during that time, I was actually a general assignment reporter, but because education was such a critical issue, as it always is, but really soaking up a lot of news and media attention at the time, I covered the TDSB mostly, but also school boards in Hamilton, Wentworth, and other places for about a year. Kate can talk, I think, more as a reporter than I do. I just want to give you some background. Currently, I sit in a host chair, generally at CBC, mostly at the Current, but also at Metro Morning. And I want to talk, who here's tried to navigate through the system that is the CBC as an advocate? Okay, right, okay, so you know firsthand that it's a difficult beast. And I'm not going to try to explain it because, frankly, I couldn't, but I will give you some tips, I think, that help navigate. The CBC is a Goliath, not because it's a huge, bulky organization, although some of you may think that, but because it serves Canadians coast to coast to coast. And under that banner, we are divided into 4 services: English radio, French radio, English television, French radio. So if you think of just that alone, that's a big system to navigate. On top of that, we have television, radio, and online. We have local, national, and international coverage. So navigating that is difficult for people, and I appreciate the difficulty of that. I most recently, just the last 2 weeks, hosted The Current. Everyone familiar with The Current on CBC Radio? Okay. So for 10 days, 10 weekdays, I host. It's an hour-and-a-half program. It's divided into 3 parts. Every day we cover 3 different topics. So as I was preparing for this, I was thinking, well, how much education do we really cover at the CBC? Now, I'm taking a 2-week litmus test that just happened, but I think it's you know, it's like this most of the time. So we had 30 parts over 10 days, 30 half-hour segments, and we covered 3 broad education stories, which were doing homework. Should kids do homework anymore, and the debate over that. And Moira was talking a little bit about where story ideas come from. And that story idea, as I recall, was a mother of 2 school-age children who's one of our producers, and came in and frankly was complaining about how her evening before was ruined by helping her terrible, horrible children who hate homework and making them do homework, and how much time she's wasted helping her children do homework. And it generated a discussion within our story meeting with other parents, with people that don't have parents, from our own experiences going through the school system about that. And that's really where that story came from. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to talk about, is homework relevant today? How much should we be doing? Is it helping students? So that just speaks to one way that stories sort of percolate up through the system. We did a story just recently, I think on Wednesday maybe, on Aboriginal education, and the need, some would argue, to improve Aboriginal education for students that live on reserves, and we approached it through a government panel that has now been disbanded, but also alternative schools that are working well to address that discrepancy. What was the other story? Oh, we did a story about, it was a small report that came out that said, it's sort of that Malcolm Gladwell-esque outliers thing, which was about if your kid's born in a certain month, their chances of being a CEO is, you know, exponentially higher. It was an American study. Not that interesting on the surface if you think about it, like interesting kind of dinner conversation with, hey, did you read this study? But we used it as a peg to talk about how the school year in Canada is set up, what the cutoff dates are, should they change, what this means for kids. I mean, we did talk about the study itself, but that's just to give you an example of what we covered on one show on the CBC in 2 weeks. So I think we're doing a pretty good job of covering education. One thing about The Current versus local shows that we broadcast across Canada. So sometimes someone will call and say, I've got this great story. Howard has called before and said, I've got this great story for you. And I say, Howard, it's really local. Right? I have, right? And I said, it's a great story, or I think they'll be interested in this story, but call the local newsroom, because The Current's not going to do that, because it only plays to a Toronto audience, and we have to be. So there are issues that percolate up through local issues, of course, all the time across Canada, that then speak to a broader audience, and we'll be able to pick up on that. But if things are really particular to one district, one city, one school, network shows are probably going to give it a pass. You'll also, so another network show is like news, what's it called now? It's CBC News Network. I always call it Newsroom, I forget. News Network, which plays across Canada, doesn't tend to do local stories. So if you have a local issue, you want to get in touch with our local newsroom. And that is one of the things that I would just add to everything that Moira said, which I agree with, except for the columnist part, because I know nothing about that, which is, for you guys, you really have to, I know it's asking a lot, but know who you're calling and why you're calling those people. So a lot of people call the national newsroom and say, I have this great story that's going on in my school, you know, Clinton Public, and could you come cover it? And the person on the other end, I don't know if they're going to be nice or not nice about it, but if they're nice and not so busy, they're probably going to say, hey, you should call the local newsroom, here's the number, I'll put you through. chances are they might be really busy or grumpy and would say, yeah, and hang up the phone. And you get frustrated, and I appreciate that. But it does help to understand how the organization that you're pitching to works. So I say that. Just one more thing, I'm gonna let Kate speak, and it's about broadcast. We're called broadcast for a reason. We have the word broad in our title, I guess. So we are doing broad things for the most part. We don't do as much detailed, I don't mean that in our reporting, but we don't focus on small issues as much as we probably should, as much as we'd like to. We are playing to a very big audience. There is a big challenge with broadcast compared to print, and that is in television, but radio as well with audio, but in television, obviously pictures. And you know, you can't make television without having pictures. That's just how it works. And I know that's also, I find it weird that people don't understand that, but I've come to understand that people don't really understand that, what we mean by pictures. So we often get a call at, say, 10 in the morning about a great story, and it has to do with students and teachers, and we can't get into a classroom because we need to get permission from the TDSB or whatever school board, and they need to get permission from the parents and all that stuff. That right there makes it impossible for us to do our jobs. Absolutely impossible. It's just a non-starter. We would like to do that story. We can't do that story that day. Broadcast deadlines generally work. I can't think of the last time I've worked on a story 2 days ahead of time, whether as a reporter or as a host. We are turning this stuff around quickly. Usually with the currents, it's usually a day, sometimes two before, but for daily news people, they're turning around, they're getting assigned at 9, 10 in the morning, and they're on air nowadays for television at around 5, 5:30, for radio as early as noon. So their turnaround is really quick. So pictures is a problem. Getting people to talk and broadcast is a challenge. So convincing people that, no, we're not going to come and throw a huge camera in your face and shine a bright light on your face, and no, don't worry, we don't care what you look like, and we'll just let us into your messy home. People generally don't like that. So preparation is the key on your part, I would say, to have people lined up, to have done your due diligence in terms of getting, you know, the permission that you can ahead of time, things like that. It may seem small, they're very big deals. On the Current, one of our biggest challenges is that we go to air at 7:30 a.m. Because we broadcast to the Atlantic time zone first. And so we are asking people across Canada to get up and get to a studio at various locations, depending where they are. So if you live in Vancouver, 7:30 in Toronto is 4:30 in the morning. So we ask people in British Columbia to get up, get to a studio, and talk with us for 30 minutes by 4 in the morning. That is asking a lot of people. And I understand that, but that is also just the nature of what we do. So I just want to say, I know in broadcast we ask for a lot from people, but it is just the nature of our business, and it's how we work. So I would say, from a broadcast perspective, preparation is really key. Getting all our ducks in a row ahead of time is really key. And I always say to people that we cover and ask for help finding people is that you can help us in that regard. And that's it. Kate?
Thanks so much. That was excellent.
This is a great lineup. I think we all like really different takes on sort of how we cover education and what we need to do to get there. You guys have covered a lot of, I think, you know, how you get your story ideas. I think there's a lot of similarities there. At the Globe and Mail, you know, again, it's a little bit different. I'm not a columnist like Maura, so being distilled, it means I have less power. But also, I think our coverage of the Globe too tends to be a bit more national. I suffer a lot from that kind of like, this is too local, although we do have a Toronto page which, depending on what's going on at City Hall, does have a lot of appetite for local stuff. It's just kind of up and down. My story idea is really largely, I see a lot of faces in this room. I talk to regularly, and their brains are, you know, they fuel my journalism. I want to welcome anyone here to get in touch, because I just always love more perspectives and more thoughts. I'm always happy to pick up the phone and just chat. You give me a story idea and I say no, just ignore it and try again. It happens all the time, and I'm always happy to hear ideas. I think the funniest story, this is kind of an interesting case of how I got a story idea, was one time, like late at night, I can't remember why I was still at the office, I'm on Twitter. This is early in Twitter too. And some superintendent, like Rural BC, tweets like, just heard about a kindergarten classroom in the seniors' home. I was just like, oh, done. Like, where do I find the travel budget? Hello, I need to see this. And that ended up being like, I ended up flying out to Rural BC to do this story. And so it can be a press release, it can be that. It's all over the map. And I just, like, I'm always happy to hear any ideas. I suspect, though, that a lot of you are here because you have concerns or complaints about how we cover education. And I think you should. I don't think we always do it right. I think there are a few problems at play. I think definitely those of us in the newsroom who have experience covering education, I think, are good allies. We do generally have help to avoid some of the biggest mistakes that the media make. But some of it's, in sort of the prep for questions and things we wanted to talk about, one of the suggestions was to talk about that tension between selling newspapers and informing the public. And I thought I might talk about some examples of where I've seen that at play. And I bring that up as an example because it's real. It exists. I work for a business. But I think sometimes the public's understanding of how that plays isn't exactly right. It's not quite the evil, insipid entity that you might think it is. So some examples recently from my own coverage where I felt like we haven't done a great job, or there's been that pressure, was with the Toronto District School Board a couple years ago, and what was called the Mosqueteria, and there was prayer in a cafeteria at a middle school during Ramadan, because the kids were leaving to go to the mosque to pray, and there were some concerns about their safety. And there's a place where that just went gangbusters on the web. Like, just clickety, clickety, click, click, click. And it was just leading the web the whole time. So my editors, of course, were like, we want as much on this as possible. And that story kind of, while I think there were good questions that came out of that story, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be covered, I think we blew it up more than we should have when things like, groups that it maybe wasn't that surprising that they would join the chorus of dissent would join. So, it was originally the Hindu, what's it called, the Hindu Canadian advocacy, which you should follow up on. Actually, the Grid did a really good piece about who they are. It turns out it's probably just one angry guy who says he's speaking on behalf of Hindus. And so but yeah, anyway, so that's obviously, I think, the media failing in the first place, and that we kind of become a voice for this guy, and I think it's questionable how much voice he should have. And then, then the JDL joined, and the Muslim Canadian Congress, these groups that it's not that surprising that they would join, and every time they would join the chorus of dissent, it'd be like, Kate, write another webhit. Yay, it's gonna get like 3,000 comments. And so that's the kind of place where I do run into that tension, and I fight against it as best I can, but ultimately I'm, on that totem pole, I'm not that high. I do have some say, but at the end of the day, I do have a responsibility to do what my bosses ask, and I do have to consider, I want my pension to exist by the time I get there, so I do have to consider those business interests too. It's just true. An example that's more, I think, me personally messing up and covering education, and I'll never forgive myself for this, is the sex ed the sex ed controversy. Like 3 years ago, I was pretty new to education when that happened, and and really, I think, distilled where I think we went wrong. I think it was day 2. Okay, sorry, for the background. I'm sure most people know this, but just for a little background, right? Dalton McGuinty's government, really, I guess it was under Kathleen Wynne, they revamped the physical health curriculum, and they had some updates that some people pulled some Charles McVety, which actually I later got called out by Extra for not sort of also giving more perspective on who Charles McVety is, which I think is debatable. But anyway, Charles McVety pulled out some clips from there that had some saucy language in it, mentions of vaginal lubrication and things not sure we want our kids to hear. And so day 2, my assignment was to find parents who had issue with this curriculum. And I sort of said, it's not like I'm getting emailed by a bunch of angry parents who think this is like so awful and their kids shouldn't learn this. And ended up, managing to find, one leader of a Catholic parents group and one leader of a Somali parents group who hadn't really read the curriculum but were up in arms about it. and didn't really understand the nuance too of the examples that were being pulled out. And so what I did, and I you know, I did push back, and I did say to my editors, like, look, there's not some course of parental descent, but I said, you know, they really wanted a story, so I said, okay, I'll write like a shorty, which is sort of, it would be sort of like 300 to 400 words, with a, like, you know, here are some of the complaints parents are raising, here's these parents I talked to, here are their issues. And what ended up happening is that story ended up getting merged with our story out of Queen's Park about all the political blowback. It ran on A1, and it ran with a headline like, you know, parents of diverse religious backgrounds unite. And in fairness, like, you know, in hindsight, I kind of think like I should have stuck in the office and made sure how this was being used. I mean, I kind of was too fresh, I think, to realize how this could happen. But a lot of these, and in fairness too, I don't think there's some editor at the office who was like merging those together and being like, let's crank this up, you know, so expressively, is not maybe understanding, you know, my perspective on what I'd written. And so yeah, and you know, and that got, I think we all remember that got pulled, and we're still, we're still in limbo, and yeah, you know, if you want to throw, you know, rotten vegetables at me, I understand. I feel awful about that. But I think I wanted to bring those up, you know, because I thought that might be interesting for you to hear, you know, but because, you know, while I acknowledge there are mistakes in what we do, I think sometimes it's easy to vilify the media and misunderstand why we mess up sometimes. And the truth is really there are people in these newsrooms who really care about coverage and really care about the impact we have. We're just, you know, we're just imperfect. That's it.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think this group's going to have better questions than what I've got. I want to ask one question and then I'll open it up. And you'll be the first one. Something that I've been struggling with is the Amanda Todd suicide and the coverage around that. Our association's involved with children and youth mental health, and we have experts at the table. And I would say about 8 months ago, those experts came to me and said, we should be talking about this issue, suicide, bullying, and children's mental health. We need to get that out into the media. And then when this case came around, they're all saying, oh, we should back off, we shouldn't be saying anything. So we're really struggling with what should be reported, how it should be reported, the conversations that go on in classrooms with kids. Should that video be shown, should it not be shown? So I'm just interested in your views on that, in your perspective.
I could start by saying probably, and I think this would be true of newspapers as well, that there probably is no topic, and I hate to call it that, that is more difficult to cover and challenge us very deeply editorially and by our own guidelines than suicide. We definitely at the CBC have policies on reporting suicides. Sometimes we break those policies depending on individual circumstances, but generally we don't report suicides for a number of reasons, and but mostly because we don't want to encourage any copycat behavior and stuff. The Amanda Todd case, I think you guys would agree, was also one of the hardest stories to cover because it is we're human and it is a tragic thing to cover. But also because it raised so many different issues and people have such different polarizing opinions about what really happened here, what really were the causes, what the various tendrils were. I can only say a couple things. One, in broadcast, of course, we can have those discussions in television about the use of the video and pictures. And the only thing I can say about that is these are very deep conversations that we have. It isn't some, you know, assignment editor barking that we're going to use them or that we're not going to use them. They go to the highest levels of our organization, and they are thoughtful conversations where people come from all sides. At the end of the day, a decision is made. Someone does get to make that decision. It is never the reporter when it comes to big issues like this. But all I would add is that these are intense conversations that go on throughout the day, and we have policies to follow and guidelines to follow, but also we take everything into account and we make our decisions based on that. So that's what I would say from a broadcast perspective, that those are some of the challenges when we were covering that story, and continue to cover it.
We had some really interesting, someone on the web circulated all this great research on basically how we impacts you when you cover these stories? Because there's a lot of great questions, right? About like at what point you're sort of, I mean, and this I think happened. At what point you're glorifying the decision that Amanda Todd made? Because at the end of the day, it's the kids who are struggling with this, who don't make the decision to kill themselves, who in a way we need to highlight. And how you do that is very difficult. And I think you also have to remember that you do want to cover Amanda Todd because in the end she is the one bringing profile to this issue. So there's this kind of tug and pull that I just never know how to handle. Thankfully, actually, having had this link go around, there was all this stuff that I really liked. It was telling me sort of like there are specifics in language that I think most people are following, that the experts have agreed, saying decided to take your own life versus killed yourself. Killed yourself, I guess, is supposed to be better. There's all these kind of, and we're really doing our best to do that. I think there's another good question though too, in sort of at OPSPA, the Public School Boards Association. You guys have been on mental health for a couple of years now, like really making it central, and it's great. It's hard sometimes without someone like Amanda for us to jump on it, which sucks. Which sucks. I wish we could give that issue as much attention as it deserves. I think it's like one of the biggest. I think it's, certainly one of the biggest, yeah. And it's too bad that we kind of in a way have to glorify Amanda's decision to get at it. But at the end of the day, I think, there's a net good right now. I think in the public minds, mental health, teen suicide is really, and bullying are, really high in those levels.
I haven't written about the Amanda Todd story. I wrote a fair bit last year on bullying and the suicides that had occurred. I mean, it's sad to say, but they do seem to occur more just before the school year starts or the beginning of the school year. I wrote quite a bit around Bill 13 and Bill 14 here in Ontario. I do, with Amanda Todd though, although I haven't written about it, I have questioned in my own mind, as Pia was saying, I mean, suicide is a really prickly issue for us in the media because there's always that concern around, do use for copycat suicides, and that's certainly not what we want to do. And yet, if you don't talk, I think there's been more discussion in media recently that if you don't talk about these things, then it's just hidden, and there will still be suicides. And so obviously we are talking about it. But I do have concerns, and I have concerns now as a parent, because I had a situation in my own household at the end of the last school year where, and my son's 10, he's in a TDSB school, and they have been talking about bullying, and he came home one day, and I knew there was something not right, and so I kept kind of prodding, and eventually he just kind of dissolved into tears. And I said, what's wrong? And I figured out they had seen a video about bullying in class that afternoon. That, in the last week or two, his friends had kind of been teasing him. He knew teasing was kind of related to bullying, and he saw this video, and in the video they talked about, in some cases, kids have taken their own lives, and he thought he might end up committing suicide because he was being teased at school. And I kind of went, oh boy, I know that's not what was intended at school because I covered this stuff all the time. And so what I did on that was, I talked to him, and then I just emailed the teacher and I said, look, this is not to blame at all, but I just thought you should know this is what happened. This is how he put all those things together. So I do have concerns as a parent and as a journalist about how we put together that the suicide piece and bullying is not a good thing piece, and report it out in a way that is helpful and constructive, and doesn't lead to copycats and doesn't lead to kids. I mean, there was a whole conversation probably that had to happen just around age appropriateness of when you talk about suicide with kids and bullying and so on. And I think bullying also brings up the whole issue of mental health and these cases. Amanda Todd, you have to pull that apart, the bullying piece versus the mental health piece, and how did that come together. So I guess the bottom line is they're hard issues, but we do think about them. I know in my Ryerson class, in the School of Journalism, that is one of the topics that we give them to think about deeply, is coverage of suicide. How much do you reveal and what don't you talk about?
I just want to say one last thing that just in, I don't know what made me think of it, but in broadcast, because we have so many broadcasts throughout the day, we don't publish once a day, there are conversations about, is this appropriate for Metro Morning, which is a program that most people listen to either in their cars, maybe driving their kids to school, or getting their kids ready to go to school. And what is appropriate for that time slot, for that show, versus say the National, which, you know, is on 10 at night, and most kids are asleep by then. So there are different ways, you'll see at the CBC, and I would argue in any broadcaster, different approaches depending on what time of day programming goes on, and we are aware of that and try as best we can to make things appropriate for our listening and viewing audience.
I'm getting help. So I'm gonna open it up, and please identify yourself and your organization if you're affiliated with somebody. Start with you.
My name's Mary Cruden, and I'm the president of the Ontario branch of Canadian Parents for French. Which, of course, is a hot issue, pretty much perennial. But that's not what my question is about. I followed the story in the Toronto Star about the access to information request. I think that was during the summer. And I wondered, I know you don't have your colleague here from the Star, but I wonder what your thoughts are about what happened around that story with the Toronto District School Board. And, you know, where do you look? How do you look? Do you find school boards across the province are responsive to access to information? And I'd like to hear your comments on that.
So are you talking about the issue with the repair
Yeah, Jimmy,
costs?
the repairs and all that stuff.
Right, so I believe that was where the Toronto Star had filed a Freedom of Information request to have access to the TDSB's database on their actual costs, yeah.
And then they responded with, you know, the bill will be.
And the bill will be, right,
Millions.
yes. So, well, I'll start, and I'm trying not to talk too long about that, and it's obviously not my story. But, I mean, any public entity that's covered under the legislation has a responsibility to respond to requests, and there are rules around how they fulfill requests from media or whoever. I mean, not just media can file those things. However, I think we're used to, especially when you're looking for difficult information, getting a first response that may have a huge price tag to it. And then there's a lot of negotiation that can go on between media outlets, lawyer, and whoever is dealing with the request or their legal counsel at the public entity around, okay, can we distill this down to something more manageable? Where are their costs coming from? And then ultimately there is a way to challenge what the response is back from the public organization you're seeking information from. So that being said, I actually don't know where the STAR's request is at. Maybe you know more about that.
We jumped on. You're like, good story. So we're part of that process now, and we're working on a deal. I do a lot of FOI-based stories where I FOI like across the country, and everybody hates me. But it's important work.
So it's directly to the communication.
Okay, so
freedom of
yeah, so basically anyone can do this, right? It's different in province to province. Sometimes it's free. In Alberta it's $25, in Ontario it's $5, and you can ask for information. There is sort of, you know, your limitations are that it needs to be sort of reasonably easy to get this information. It's sort of a record that has to exist, so that the information has to be there somewhere. And then there are limitations, like if it takes a lot of effort to compile this information somehow, they will charge you for their time. And that's where the Toronto District School Board maintenance issue has come in. They're saying it's going to be like $1 million.
Right, the charges are in the legislation now. It's not, I mean, the clarification here is that the charges are in the legislation.
what becomes a bit more questionable is how much work it's actually gonna take to get it. And I know this because I've done a lot of projects where I'll have a sort of set of questions and I'll ask people across the country, I'll ask school boards. And I've had scenarios where, and very simple information. And I've had scenarios where like one school board, it'll take them an hour. Another school board wants to charge me $3,000 and it says it'll take them like a month. So part of that is just, you know, and I usually find the best thing is I try to work with them and explain like, and as you get to know the subject area too, you can say, well, I know you have this record, you know, and I know there's this privacy concern. If you can give me this record with this blocked out, I can work with that. Like I definitely spend a lot of time trying to know what kind of records they have and trying to work. And there's often, the problem is too, depending on who you're working with, I find some people get defensive. Like as soon as you file an FOI, they think you're like out to root them out for being evil, which isn't the case.
Or stupid, according
Or,
to
yeah, there's a lot of, and so like being in communications, you know, there's like sometimes there's a bit of a like, oh, don't you think we give this, you give
Never happened.
And so my first effort is always to, you know, be like that, you know, that I just need to have, you know, I just want to have a sense of this information. You know, I'm not trying to play gotcha, I'm just trying to understand. You know, I spend a lot of time kind of working with how we can make collecting that information more interesting for them. If you find, and this happens, if you find you have, you know, someone who for whatever reason is not cooperating and seems to be, you know, which could be because they don't want the data out, or it could be because they just feel like your request is, you're being a dick and they don't like you. It happens. Then I think you just go to a mediator, right? Then you can bring in, mediators from the Ontario Department of Information. Yeah, they have like these mediators who are usually pretty great. And if you know the letter of the law and what you're entitled to, I find usually you can come out on top with those negotiations. I mean, their job too, when the mediator comes in, their job, they just want everybody to be happy. So usually you'll get something out of them at the end of it. That's, if I'm understanding what you're kind of looking for, yeah.
Can I take your turn?
I don't need it.
The only thing I would say about that, regardless of whether it was too much or too little, that incident gave that story legs. So from the communications department's perspective, you'd like that initial story to die down, and the fact that this is taking place, it just means the story's going to be repeated and repeated, which is not the ideal situation.
Jeff, I'm Mike Carson. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Ottawa Carleton Board. So for a long time, I've been in the middle. We have a communications person that would really like to be able to give the person what they need. And then we have other colleagues who are saying, why would we? And so there's a lot of push-pull. And as we said, there is a cost to gathering the data, especially if it's useful. Like I remember when I worked for the Children's Aid Society, they asked for stuff. We could dump the database and there'd be no cost to it. But it wasn't going to help. And so the cost was then in moving it forward, because as you said, you've got some places, because of the investment in technology, it's a 10-minute job, and in some, and even in the bigger agencies, with the bigger boards, it's not just going to happen overnight. You've got to assign people to it. So there's a lot of push-pull, and rarely is it just because we're being pig-headed, although I have been once in a while.
I should say I've done like over 100, and I can think of like really once, maybe 1.5, where there was a pig-headed problem. Like it's rare, it happens.
So it's tough, and it is a bit of a trade-off along the way. But from my point of view, and I used to be the superintendent dealing with school closures and those processes, the more information you give people and the quicker you give it to them, the better the understanding of it. So I think it's, not everybody's got the same point of view, but in general, if a board has a communications person, they're going to be moving us to try to move us in the right direction. And I think over the years, as we listen to people like Roger and some of the work we've done on creativity, the more that's out there, the better if you can do it.
Catherine Soffa, I'm a parent with the Kill District School Board. And I was just grateful that we revisited the arena of how you report, because it prompted in me a question about why are we here for public education, and most of us want public education so our kids will progress to post-secondary education. Post-secondary education is the purview of the federal and province, and it tends to be an urban issue, and public education is supposed to be for everybody. So if you won't carry a public education story, that seems to be local, how do we ramp that up so that you get the national tone, so that we can get, from some rural area in BC to a university in Newfoundland? Because they're connected, but there's no way to tell the story.
The key for me, like when a story moves from local, like something that really impacts only locally, but then maybe becomes a national story is, sometimes it's reflective of attention that plays out elsewhere. Really good example of something that was really narrow that went national was there's a school board, a really rural school board in Alberta that's struggling with the kids are on the bus for like 2 hours each way, and they're like and so I found out that they were running a pilot where they were thinking of like having the kids do 4-day work weeks, or like 1 day of continuing or distance e-learning, or maybe putting Wi-Fi on the school buses. Anyway, so that's really like one school board, right? But then you can talk about this kind of issue of like there's technology in the classroom and e-learning is like bigger. So then that way that story could kind of have national legs, right? So there's, I guess that's the easy way to put it. If it's some kind of issue that speaks to everyone in some way, that's a really good way for a more local story to go on.
I would just add to that, it's just a session somewhere about pitching stories, which is what people like yourselves do. You pick up the phone, you call news organizations, and say, hey, I've got a great story, which is great, and we want you to do that because we are only so big, and Canadians are our eyes and ears on the ground, and we don't know everything. We don't pretend to. But just some tips on doing that. A local story is often national. We often don't know about it. So if you have a local issue at your school board, but you know what's going on, also something very similar at a rural board in BC, you should draw that to our attention. But this is, also this isn't just a Toronto story. This is happening there. That's really helpful for us. People often call, I think Mari spoke to this, they send out press releases, they send an email to someone who was in a job a year ago, we never hear about it, they don't follow up. They say, call me, between 2 and 2:30, I've only got half an hour to talk to you. This is not to disparage anyone, and that everyone is busy, and we appreciate that, but the more you can do to help us out in making stories, in this case more national, but also just getting our more than just phoning saying, I've got a great story. We're holding a conference. It's our 25th annual conference on education. And I say, okay, well, we've covered it for 24 years, so that's not news. Yeah. What's new? If you call me and say, we are holding our 25th annual conference on education, and this year we're talking about something we've never talked about, we're focusing on bullying, we know it's a big issue right now because of the case in BC, that will pique our interest. So yeah, it doesn't mean that something's local, that it won't go national, or international for that matter. We often, and I know the systems are different, but we often use American examples or British examples. But you've got to do some legwork on your end, is what I would say, right? It's not that useful just to pick up and say, I've got a great idea. You might pick up the phone or tweet and say, I heard this amazing thing, that's helpful. But sometimes I think this idea that person A picks up phone, calls media outlet B, and therefore media outlet B should do the story that person A is called. It's a bit of a romantic idea, I think, and usually doesn't work. So just think about, I'm not asking you to put yourself in our shoes, but just for 30 seconds, think what would they need to do to make this a story. You guys are all consumers of media, so you do have more insight into what we need to make stories than you probably think you do. So just for 30 seconds, think, what would they need? But yeah.
A quick fix for that, like distilled, I think what we're all saying is like, you can have where you fit in the national picture. Like this is happening here, but this is what it means relative. Are you part of a growing trend? Are you the exception? Are you, I think that kind of perspective helps a lot for whether something is going to be a national story. You guys at Peel had the French immersion story recently.
Sure did.
And that was, I think that was a story just because access to French immersion is a big deal, but it was interesting. So the Peel recently decided there's going to be wait lists, that there's going to be a lottery to get into French immersion. And so one really good way to pitch that, say it wasn't already sold, would have been if you guys had any perspective on, does anyone else do that? Like, who else has a lottery? Are you guys the first ones to do a lottery? Like, those kinds of big questions, just being able to answer one or two of them to get where you are in the puzzle, I think distilled is a really good way to nationalize it.
Lisa, well, we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4.
First, I just want to say thank you for what you guys do. I know that your opinions don't always fall in line with everybody's, but you do allow for there to be a conversation, whether that's yelling at you or agreeing with you. So thank you for that. My question is, how do you marry your personal opinion with what a policymaker is saying with what the general public thinks? And how do you make sure that that marriage provides information, but is also engaging, but also leads to the bigger question?
And do you get a?
Explain journalism.
I think there's a difference between if you're a columnist, and a journalist, in that one gives an opinion, one gives facts without infusing their opinion.
Or tries to.
Or tries to, gives their best attempt. So how do you do that? 'Cause I mean, some people do it really, really well. Some people, if I would be arrested, I would want to strangle. And some people, they just totally get the facts wrong because they want to give their opinion instead. So how do you marry all of that?
So you're talking about how do you maybe fairly represent the policy person, or the newsmaker's perspective? How do you fairly represent that and then give your opinion and kind
Yeah, so without being crass, how do you distill from the minutia the truth and add your opinion in there to make
Okay.
it more of a?
Right.
I'll just start by saying, facts are facts. So journalists screw up facts. You have every right to pick up the phone and tear a strip off the phone on a strangle, right? Facts are, they're called facts for a reason. They're not truths, which truths are something different, but facts are facts. So if you find something wrong with a fact, and it is a non-debatable fact, therefore a fact, you should raise that issue. Two, you said something about what the general public thinks, and I always find that interesting, because you'll pick up the phone and call me and say, well, parents think this. And I'll think, wow, did you talk to every parent? And so when we sort of lump people into large groups, it's really hard. So my job is not to advocate for parents. There's a lot of diversity within that group. That is not my job as a journalist. So we're informed by talking to a lot of people, by asking challenging questions. Moira has a different job than Kate, and certainly I do, because she's a columnist, and she comes at, I think, her job and her profession from a more personal point of view. That said, I got a young kid and 2 more on the way, and am interested in education, obviously more so than before my kid got. So we're informed by a lot of things, but I'm just trying to get to the heart of your question, and I'm not sure I've got it, which is how do we sort of mesh all this stuff together and come up with what we're going to say? Is that?
Yeah, so, facts are facts, but like the law, facts can be stretched, so it can be gray area, different interpretations. Everybody has a political view, which informs the way that they maybe interpret the facts. And then there are people who generally say, you know what, I am not an expert. I am somebody who just reads the newspaper. This is what I've read, this is what I think it should be. How do you marry all of that?
I think this has come up a lot with me lately. We've been
Okay.
covering in Ontario the labour strike, and especially on Twitter, which is really fun. I get jumped on sometimes for being really pro-union or really pro-teacher, and I think 99% of the time it's fair. I don't struggle with feeling like I'm being fair. Like I think I really am able to put aside my political opinions and be able to just report it. It doesn't always work. I think one that was so I guess as the labor example, for example, one thing that's happened a lot is people have started referring to Bill 115 as legislative wage freeze, which is not. It's not fair. And I think, and I've worked really hard to kind of get around. I think I did use it once, very honestly. I think I did, but it wasn't. That's not my political opinion. Do you see what I mean? But teachers reading that would be like, oh, and actually I did. I got jumped on Twitter like, oh, look at the Globe and Mail being anti-union. It's like, well, no, actually, I think a lot of the times you think we're showing our opinion, and really we're just, maybe having imperfect coverage, or maybe that is, I don't think that's an example of that, but maybe that is the best way to explain that legislation, right? Actually, another thing I've got a lot of questions like, why don't you explain the sort of, gray constitutional area that Bill 15 exists within? And be honest, it's kind of not the point for that story. I've raised some questions around it, but it's not my political strike that informs whether you're right about that. So I think, and I know I read all the coverage and actually follow most of the coverage, certainly on radio. I watch TV less, but, and I think, with some exceptions, the vast majority of major outlets do put that aside, and I think the flaws you're seeing might have less to do with political opinion than you might think. One that was hard for me though was the GSA debate. That was a little harder, because that was, right, your own opinion I think informed how much credence you gave to each side and how you kind of balance them. Like I had a lot of questions about whether the issues that some people were raising about, we're forcing kids by being part of a gay straight alliance, we're forcing them to identify as gay, and that's bad, that's a label, Because to be honest, I don't find that argument very convincing. And so that was really, I think that's one place where maybe my politics did come in a bit. But that's the only honesty, and I'm being very kind of self-deprecating today. Like, I think that is the only example I can think of where really there was a real tension there.
And I would say as a columnist, I'm gonna have my opinion. As far as how, the people who are gonna read what I write are concerned, the only way that I'm thinking of them is not what opinion do they hold, but what questions would they ask. And if I'm gonna write, in a certain way, or I'm gonna present this issue in this way, would they come up with some more questions and say, well, hey, what about, maybe there's a hole in what I've written. So I try to think that way as far as when I'm thinking about who's going to be reading what I write. As far as presenting, sifting through all of the information and coming up with something, I think I'm helped partly from having covered these things for a long time, so I have familiarity with what the issues are, who the players are, how they come at these things. I mean, as far as presenting what they think, I do try to at least, I try not to take things out of context, although I'm sure I would be accused of that, but I try not to. And then present my own opinion about it as well. I think that, as a columnist, for me, I think that's still my obligation, is to at least fairly represent what the different players involved think, and then fairly represent what I think too.
My name is Sheila Patterson. I'm the Executive Director for the Ontario Library Association. So many of the media calls that we get are around censorship issues, or when a school library shuts down in a school, that sort of thing. One of our frustrations that we see not happening in the media is a meaningful dialogue with our elected officials, decision makers. So when something happens that is in the public realm and it does resonate with the ministry, we're not seeing that conversation. We're not seeing a deep conversation around, well, this is why, or this is what happens, or this is what we think, and this is what we hope. So my question is the media are these people being contacted, and are they giving back the no comment? Because we can have a lot of perspectives in the media on some of these issues, but it's rare, it seems, that a minister or a policymaker or somebody who's in that kind of position is actually having the dialogue in the media. So are they just shutting you out, is my question.
And are you asking that because you feel they're the people who are ultimately responsible for?
They have a role in it, for sure. I think there's responsibility. We've elected these people because we believe in what they're doing, and then they're not engaging. And I'm sure there's a lot of fear, and I'm sure there's a lot of sticking to the party line. But what has happened to the discussion in the media with some meaningful comments from that side and meaningful observations and meaningful perspectives and information? It just doesn't seem to be happening.
So you find that they're absent from the stories that are
or there's a
covering.
party line that.
So I think just, one thing is if we have two voices in the story or three, we probably talked to about 25
Yeah.
people, right? So there's just that, first of all. I can't make people say meaningful things.
No.
I can't. And I can't actually make them talk. I can
Yeah.
bully badger if I need to, and I've been accused of that a lot in the last couple of weeks. But I can't make them say things. I think you do raise a good point, though, and I think it's a conversation that's happening more and more in media organizations, especially with the increased social media and how that's changing everything. But and that's the idea of transparency. And so I think you speak to a good thing, which is a real, what I would say, I would consider sort of a throwaway line, but you've raised it and it's made me think that it is. And like, we tried to contact people at the ministry, we say that all the time, and sometimes we don't. And I think it's, you raise a good issue that we need to say that we have done our due diligence. So we have called, so you're probably frustrated thinking, well, why wouldn't she have called them? When really I have.
Yeah.
And I think, I take your point, which is maybe a little more transparency in that is probably a good thing.
Well, and I think you raise a good point around, you know, if they have anything meaningful to say, because unfortunately, I would say that more with the provincial government, I have good relationships with communications officers there, but I have to say, you know, half the time, the stuff that they come back to me with to answer my questions is just, it's political pap. It's just, I mean, okay, and I've got, you know, one column has 550 words and the other has 600, and am I gonna use like 50 of those words to just spout this party line?
50,
or-
they never have a sentence less than 100.
Well.
With that being it.
Right, so, so sometimes it's not that they had no comment, but their comment was just so,
Useless.
useless that it just didn't contribute to the understanding the issue.
I'm trying to think of better ways to call them out for being gobbledygooky without sounding catty.
You're gonna be catty.
So, you know, I'm trying to think
That is a good thing for communications people. You all work with various school boards and work at various school boards. Your job as a communications person is not to feed us BS or gobbledygook, right? That is not what you get paid to do as a communications person. Your job is not to stonewall us and say, yeah, I'm not gonna help you out. That is not what you get paid for. Your job is to actually open doors for us and to help us do our jobs somewhat more easily. So I would just say that that's a reminder, because all of you work with communications people and sometimes do communications for various organizations. So gobbledygook sucks. Doesn't say anything. People do it deliberately though, all the time. They get their way when we don't quote them, right? So it is a strategy, but oftentimes it's just because you know, someone's written down a line and they just stick to it. Not because they're being vindictive or anything, but they're nervous or whatever. But you know, we've heard it before.
It's really the point you make. Alan Bragg made an address recently to a university, talked about Orwell's 1984 and how governments are not answering questions, how they're naming bills, putting students first, for example, which, you know, so it's, you may want to access that. It's worth reading. Not next person.
It is something, I'll just say, that we struggle with the media as more and more governments use this as a strategy.
Hi, excuse me, I'm Andrew, I'm a parent and a teacher. And I guess when I get frustrated about education coverage in the media, it's when I often feel like stories are complicated and have various perspectives on them, and they don't get represented. And it seems that that complex nature of these stories is contrary to our current media landscape and the way we're presenting media and the way we're sampling media. When I reflected on that, I wondered if maybe everybody thinks that way. Maybe politicians think it's way more complicated than it gets represented. But do you agree? Do you think we're doing a good job of representing the complexity of views on these stories, or not? Is that an issue?
I think it's an issue. I think we're probably not as guilty as people like to make it out to be. That
I'm not suggesting you're guilty. I'm suggesting it's the
They're complex.
parameters that you're working
they're
within.
complex. There are some. Well,
the thing I always have to say too is I can't deliver news like medicine. You know, like I think sometimes people get like, why didn't you say this and this and this? And it's like, well, it's not for me to tell readers that they have to read this. You know, to some extent, I have a responsibility to package this issue in a way that will be compelling and interesting and informative. You know, and sometimes I think too, being on the inside, and you know, we've all been, being on the inside of an issue, you have a different perspective maybe on what needs to be told. I don't think we're perfect at it, but I think maybe, for anyone who's been involved with, say, the labor strike recently, I think the lens you may have on it is probably, you bring your own bias to what our coverage is accomplishing. And you might not, I think, sometimes people might read someone, say a teacher who reads some of my coverage, might react and go, oh my God, she's being so pro-government, and then someone who's reading it from the government's probably emailing me and saying, like, why are you being so good to the teacher?
And I would just say that, I was a news reporter for many years, and I'm not here to disparage news at any outlet, but it is a bit more simplistic. You've got a minute and a half or 400 words, there's only so much you can fit in there. Versus a current affairs show or a column or a focus section piece, which is more readily available because of time to speak to the complexities. So yeah, I mean, you can be hopping mad because when you turn on the news at 6 o'clock, a 1.5 minute piece doesn't address the complexities of an issue, but I don't think that that's what news is there to do in its entirety. There are other places that in the media that do delve into the more complex issues. That said, I think I take your point that we do rely too heavily on the he said, she said, and we always have, and probably getting worse at it. So we're always looking for diverse talkers, people that represent divergent views, not just one side and then the other. And again, that's sort of the plea for help that I always say to people, like, we're really in the business of your business, so help us out when doing things like that.
And maybe another thing to consider is, since you're a teacher yourself, thinking about how you present a subject to your students. Do you snow them with all the complexity of something, or are you picking out a few choice parts to at least get them into it before you get into more of the complexity of the whole field? I mean, I remember my science teacher saying, well, I'm going to teach this to you this way, but that's not actually the whole truth. You'll find that out when you get to university. But it was just, if he told me, like, I can't remember what it was, electrons or whatever. In fact, I think he even told me that it wasn't even exactly accurate, but it would at least get me going. We're trying to be accurate, but I mean, to your point, and in my column, I mean, I should probably just try to hit on 3 main points in a column, and that's probably as much as the readers can take. Otherwise, I lose them, or you lose your students.
Teachers are also hard. They often phone and say, blah, 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 but I can't talk to you, which is really hard. It's really frustrating, and I get that. And I'll just give you a quick, I guess it was the week before last, it was an education story. It must have been on the homework thing. We go to air at 7:37 on the current. We have a half-an-hour discussion. I've got 2 guests. And at 7:26, one of our guests said, oh yeah, the school board told me last night I can't talk about this. 3 minutes before I go to air and I have to talk for half an hour to 2 people, my guest has bailed. I'm having a heart attack. I'm 39 years old and I'm having a heart attack. So I'm just saying, teachers are a difficult species, and I get it. You're tied. Your hands are tied by a lot of higher ups. Your principal, your vice principal, your principal, your school board. Your own livelihood could be at stake, right? I only say that because sometimes getting to complex issues sounds like something we should be able to do more easily, and sometimes it's just not a reality because people won't talk to us about it.
Okay, we're 5 minutes beyond, so let's make a deal here. Let's make a deal. Thank you, of course. We just started this conversation. Our association has a conference in February the 1st at 1 o'clock in Sheridan. Why don't we convene the panel? You're available, and you're all invited, and we'll continue this. Because I think we just started to scratch the surface.
And you'll
right?
like have specific examples from our work.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If anyone has questions, please, I mean, I please stay clear.
Oh, fantastic. Well, so I have to please thank these 3. I'm reminded of a story that Amanda Lang tells when she goes to the States, and she says, how do you get 50 Canadians out of the pool? And the answer is, please leave the pool. So, now that it's lunchtime, please go have some lunch. Thank you very much.
Peter's one.
Hey, how you doing? Nice to meet you in person. How you doing? I'm good. Were you happy with Quad? Yeah? Good. Yeah, I think it worked really well. I think you were amazing. Yeah. What do you think of that? This?
What I've seen is, when I was doing the story, launching early on,
Not worth it.
either specialists. But there are a lot of journalists that are doing the story, but they don't know the detail.
So that's what I was trying to get at, because when I talked to one of my friends is an education reporter, but he's not doing education now. And he said, a lot of times reporters, they have 3 beats. They show it to a press conference, they get it, and then it's like, boom, and on to the next story. He says, they don't have the training, they don't have the knowledge, and they don't have the time to explain it fully. So,
I've seen part of help the producers. It's amazing